A shell landed on the scree slope outside the dry riverbed, and the dust it kicked up settled back into the gully like a gray blanket pressed down into the trench. Hans braced his back against the cold rock wall, his left hand clamped over the canteen at his chest, almost empty now, his right hand rubbing the grip of the signal pistol again and again. The radio at headquarters had been silent for 2 full days. They had stripped the battery down to the last reserve, enough to light an indicator once. The truck behind them had no fuel. The pass ahead had been cut by Allied artillery into a line no one could cross. What he could still command had narrowed to a single flare cartridge on his belt. He pulled the last stack of encrypted slips from his map pouch. The paper edges had gone soft with sweat. The ink had bled into the folds. He tore them into smaller pieces, stuffed them into his palm, rolled them into a tight wad, then used his fingernails to press the wad deep into a crack in the stone until grit covered it. The immediate consequence was that the skin on his fingers split. Blood turned tacky in the grooves of his palm, making the pistol harder to hold steady, but the pain forced him to remember that he was still acting under obligation. He drew the pocket poetry book from his inner jacket pocket. The cover had been abraded pale by sweat and salt, but the spine still held its stiffness. A black and white photograph tucked between pages slid under his fingertip. Its corners were slightly curled, as if reminding him there had once been time that did not belong to this gully. A harsher constraint closed in at once. The position had only 3 men left who could still count rhythm by regulation, and the intervals between the roars above the shelter were shortening. Any hesitation that was not essential would drag them into the next impact zone. He turned to a familiar page and let his gaze rest on the lines, using visible words to push back the vertigo rising in his head. Before the war, in lecture halls in Leipzig, he had learned to treat a line of verse like a nail, something that could pin him in place and keep the noise from carrying him away. Now the nail had become light, short, and long. A soldier beside him gestured that the flare should be used to call for rescue. Hans did not answer. He broke the poem into rhythm and chose not the content of a plea, but a meter a listener could recognize. When he screwed the flare into the barrel, his movements were deliberately slow, as if tightening the last turn of order. He tapped his knuckles on his knee, confirming he could still tell a brief interval from a held one, then slid the poetry book back into his inner pocket and felt the hard edge of the photograph press against his ribs. Then he raised the signal pistol above the lip of the gully, waited for a moment when the artillery seemed to take a breath, and pressed the trigger with his thumb. The light burst in the night, painfully white. He forced its short and long flicker into an almost mechanical stability. Each pause came with a dry swallow in his throat. He heard the breathing of comrades somewhere farther off and felt his own heartbeat striking in his hollow stomach. When the signal ended, there was no answering flash, only denser gunfire swallowing the light. A moment later, the sound of pebbles rolling told him the gully's edge had been walked in by ranging fire at least once. He understood that what he had released into the sky could not have fallen into emptiness alone. A new limitation appeared with it. The enemy's impacts began creeping toward the rim, and the skeleton of the retreating group loosened under panic. He pressed the poetry book deeper against his body. His fingers touched the photograph's corner and stopped for an instant, as if checking that it was still there. Then he latched the holster back in place and urged the remaining men to crawl north along the dry channel, trying to trade the bends of the terrain for a few minutes of air. At the same time, in an Allied forward listening post, a crude photoelectric receiver converted distant pulses of brightness into a broken series of beeps in a headset. Second Lieutenant Carter looked up from the record table, first confirming it was not the standard rhythm of friendly illumination rounds, Then followed procedure and had the man on watch keep recording the pulses while he wrote the bearing from the compass into his notebook. He weighed the odd signal against targets with higher priority. He kept the sample anyway, ordered a supplemental check, and had another station return a second bearing. The decision immediately consumed a slice of time that could have been used to track encrypted radio, and it forced him to run an extra cross-check in the noise. In the gully, Hans fell at a bend, his knee striking stone. The pain snapped him into clarity for a moment. He tugged the poetry book partly from his inner pocket to make sure the cover had not torn, then pushed the photograph farther inside so its edge would not show. The direct result was that he lost half a beat of speed. The man behind him had to stop to help him up. The group bunched together in the channel, a clearer target, and the shells above detonated closer. Stones fell like rain. They had barely rounded the riverbed's second switchback when an Allied patrol line appeared ahead. Shadows of rifle barrels moved between rocks, and hand signals ordered everyone to stop. Hans tried to raise the signal pistol in a gesture that might communicate identity, but his wrist was pressed down at once and his body shoved to the ground. They demanded he hand over everything he carried. He held the poetry book to his chest as if it were a hard object that could prove he was still some kind of person, until his arms were bound behind him and his chest was forced to open. A temporary collection point had been set in a low area, and wire fencing divided the crowd into several slow-moving queues. Registration and searches advanced in order. Items were gathered on a rough wooden table and then bagged. When it was Hans's turn, the act of handing over the poetry book came with a visible hesitation. His fingers refused to leave the cover as he tried to slip the photograph out first and hide it back inside his clothing. The struggle brought immediate, harsher control. He was pulled away from the table. His pockets were turned out completely, and the photograph was taken with the book. The poetry collection and the photograph were sealed into a clear bag. The seal was pressed shut. The moment the initial label was applied, authority over the objects passed out of his hands and into an unseen process. He could only watch the bag shoved toward the inspection pile while he was taken away alone, separated from the place where he might see it again. Morning sea fog rolled inward through the pass, and the ground at the collection point had been trampled into thick gray mud. Hans was shoved into a narrower wire corridor by himself. His wrists still carried numb pressure marks, and his chest felt cold with emptiness. He could see the clear bags piled behind the wooden table like a small hill, labels facing outward, seal impressions neat. The poetry book and photograph lay among them like organs cut off from breath. Each time someone lifted a bag and set it down again, the rasp of plastic sounded like a reminder that the objects no longer obeyed him. The man at the registration table did not look up. He pushed each prisoner in fixed sequence to a line painted on the ground. The constraint was clean and hard. The queue had to move at a steady pace, and any pause drew the guards closer. Hans tried to slow his steps just enough to gain one look at the bag, and the direct consequence was that he was forced back into the rhythm. His shoulder blade struck a wooden post. His breathing shortened. Meanwhile, a soldier in gloves lifted the bag with the poetry book, dropped it into a larger canvas sack, and cinched the sack's mouth shut with a tie. The bag vanished from the tabletop, and even his last glance was cut off by cloth. A rear inspection station had been established in a warehouse whose window frames had been shaken loose by shelling. The lights were stark white. The air smelled of disinfectant and damp paper pulp. Paper items were diverted to a separate line to reduce the risk of hidden writing and contamination. When the poetry book was pulled from the canvas sack, salt stains still marked the cover. An inspector wiped it with a dry cloth, pressed the spine flat, and held each page under the light for a brief moment. The direct result was that the spine was forced open, and the place where a page had been used as a pocket was exposed. The photograph was lifted out with tweezers and sealed into a smaller, clear sleeve. The sleeve's mouth was heat-sealed and then labeled with a number. Once that number was written down, return could only happen by completing the later verification chain. Hans was made to sit on a bench on the far side of the wire, close enough to see the motions of the gloves, far enough that he could not reach. A new limitation came from the fact that he could not prove the meaning of any page. He could only watch them treated as carriers. He fixed his attention on the photograph's corner, afraid it would be bent or broken. The consequence was that when his name was called, he reacted half a beat late. It was marked in a list. He was ordered through an additional identity check. His weight lengthened and water distribution was delayed for him. The dryness in his throat rasped like sandpaper. A guard pulled him to the barrier and signaled for him to confirm his property through plastic. The clear bag was pushed briefly toward him. Under the lights, the poetry book's cover looked washed out, and the photograph, sealed in its smaller sleeve, lay against the inside of the same bag. Hans pressed his fingertip to the plastic without thinking, trying to let the touch replace the weight he had lost. The direct consequence was that the inspector snapped the bag back, wiped away the fingerprint, and pressed the edge of the seal again. The added pressure left a deeper impression, and the return steps gained another traceable checkpoint. At the station, every underline in the book was rechecked as a potential signal. The inspector ran blotting paper lightly along the page edges, then held the book to a strong light page by page, confirming there was no hidden layer. The book and photograph were sealed back into clear bags, the seals pressed tight, and the items placed into a categorized storage cabinet. The direct result was that return was deferred. Hans received nothing back that day. His fingerprints were taken again so the objects and the man could be matched later. The black ink dried on his thumb like a thin film that would not rub off. By evening, Hans was called to a temporary table to acknowledge a notice. His items were not there. Only a number and a short statement were presented, pointing to continued inspection and waiting. The constraint became more specific. He had to return to the barracks within the required time, or the next day's rations could be affected. He tried to use silence to preserve a last piece of dignity, and the result was that a guard escorted him back by a stricter route. Stops were no longer permitted. Even the angle of turning his head was suppressed by gesture. At night, snores and coughing tangled in the barracks. Hans pinched the empty inner pocket between his fingers as if he could still feel the hard edge of paper. He finally understood that the string of light he had sent up had not brought a defiant reply, yet it had pushed him into another kind of reply, longer and slower. It carried no emotion, only seals, numbers, waiting, and compelled cooperation, grinding his story into something that could be processed. In the afternoon heat, the shadows on the wire stretched long. The camp's ground cracked and dust rose into a thin haze each time names were called and boots shifted. Hans was ordered out, made to stand at a temporary table with both hands on rough boards, his fingertips still tacky from the ink of previous days. The constraint came from the guard's gestures and the crowd's eyes. He could not turn around and could not approach any storage area. He could only catch the road to the inspection station out of the corner of his vision, as if the length of that road were the distance between him and the poetry book. In the listening post tent, Carter packed the night's abnormal sample into a metal box, labeled the lid with date and band, and slid the box back onto the shelf, yet his fingers did not let go at once. The limitation was authority. A low-priority entry could not consume more direction-finding time and could not trigger direct requests to operations. He chose to turn the need into an internal correlation query. He wrote a brief note with the recorded bearings and time, added equipment calibration status and weather changes, and tried to make it complete enough that upstream staff would not need to ask him to clarify. His goal was not to change the battlefield, it was to leave a traceable loop inside the system for the anomaly. The moment the paper was handed to the routing desk, the direct consequence was that it was broken into a longer chain. A receiving stamp came down. The file entered a waiting tray to be sent to the next node. Only during routine aggregation, Carter could do nothing but mark an internal reference number in his case folder and circle the blank fields that would need to be filled later so the receipt would match when it returned. He tried to submit an extra page to shorten the back and forth, but the duty sergeant pressed the motion down with a fixed ordering. Encrypted traffic kept rolling through the headset. He returned to the chair and continued filtering, pressing curiosity back under procedure. At the same time, the poetry book did not remain in the inspection cabinet. During recheck, the inspector noted underlining and folded corners. The material constraint escalated immediately. The paper could carry hidden writing or coordinate hints and had to go through a finer technical path. The book was taken out again. The seal was checked for lifting at the edges. Then every page was held to a strong light. Then blotting paper was run along the spine and margins. Finally, the pages were spread out in ventilation for a brief time to dry. The direct result was that the seal was pressed yet again, leaving deeper impressions. The poetry book and photograph were placed into new clear sleeves. The old sleeves were voided and sealed as records. The number was updated and return was pushed back until the recheck conclusion. Hans waited until dusk before he was brought to the barrier again. The table still held no poetry book, only a repeatedly read number and an order to fingerprint again. The constraint tightened into specifics. He had to roll thumb and forefinger through ink and press them onto paper. If the mark was not clear, he had to do it again. The repeated pressure made his fingertips burn and swell. The direct result was that when he returned to the barracks, grasping was harder. Even fastening a button took extra effort, and the rim of a cup on his lips felt like sandpaper. He tried to let hesitation stand in for resistance. The line was forced to stop, and the guard immediately shoved him to the front, making him complete the process under a brighter lamp. The light bleached his vision and also revealed the ink film on his hands. The friction of procedure did not answer his feelings. It only broke his movement into verifiable steps. He began to understand that any extra struggle would only add repetitions, prolonging separation from the objects. Another limitation followed. The camp began grouping men by injury and labor capacity. He was placed into a queue that had to be ready at any time to carry loads. Sleep was compressed. Hunger made it harder to keep anger sharp. Days later, Carter received a fragment of reply from the routing chain. The paper was thin and brief. It pointed only to a property handling node number and a pending recheck status, noting that seal consistency required further verification. Carter pasted the slip into the case folder. The immediate consequence was that the abnormal sample became a line connected to the capture chain. Yet it remained labeled low priority, not enough to move any rhythm of resources. On night watch, he repeatedly checked his own notes, making sure every time difference could be explained. He knew that if the chain broke, the effort would be filed as useless miscellany, and the anomaly would be covered like noise. Hans also learned to track the poetry book without seeing it. And each time he was taken to fingerprint or confirm, he studied the seal impressions and the changing numbers as if using those marks to calculate who held the object now. The new limitation was that he could not ask and could not touch. In the few seconds allowed, he had to memorize details. The choice brought a direct consequence. In the barracks, he stopped spending strength on anger and saved attention for judgment when the next procedure arrived. He began counting steps from being called out to being returned, and the length of each wait. During another confirmation, he saw the poetry book's cover through the clear sleeve. It looked whiter than he remembered. The photograph's smaller sleeve was attached beside it, its heat-sealed edge neat as a cut line. A new seal impression crossed the tape like an unerasable crease. And the number was not the same as before, proof that it had been moved and resealed. Hans's hand paused in the air. He did not press the plastic this time. He slowed his breathing and waited inside the rhythm of rules for the next conclusion. He finally understood that his light code had not drawn an answering flash of defiance, yet it had pulled him into a longer reply made of paper, seals, waiting, and receipts, cold and stable like an assembly line that stopped for no one. Carter left the abnormal sample on the shelf for days, still opening the case folder before each shift to confirm the number had not been copied wrong. The limitation came from his superior's allocation of resources. He could not take another direction-finding window to chase it. He could only let the correlation query run along its routing chain. One morning, a receipt was clipped into the routine file bundle delivered to his desk. Its corner held dust. The content stated that the property handling node in the capture area had received the request and was in recheck. Carter placed the receipt into the case folder. The direct result was that the anomaly was no longer just a rhythm in his headset. It was now a line that had to be closed. He had to complete his documentation to a standard that anyone could trace. Otherwise, it would be filed as a lapse in the next audit. As the receipt continued flowing rearward, a clerk at the inspection station first pulled the corresponding storage card from a file cabinet, then matched the seal number against the storage key register. A new constraint came from accountability and the need to prevent disputes. Any retrieval required 2 people present and a recorded time. The cabinet door was opened, the clear sleeves were removed, the seal edges were checked under a lamp, then the items were carried back to the inspection table for a final dry out and translucence check. The direct consequence was that the poetry book and photograph received a return authorization marker, but it also meant they had to move from storage chain to handover chain. What had once only needed sealing and filing now required locating a specific man to complete the return. That day, Hans had been assigned to carry water buckets, rope-biting heat into his shoulder. A guard signaled for him to be pulled from the labor line and taken to a narrower wire corridor to wait. The constraint offered no explanation. It appeared as a painted line and a requirement for fixed pace. He had to keep distance from the men ahead and behind, and his hands had to remain visible. On the walk toward the inspection area, the ground was covered with gravel and dried mud crust. Each step made a small cracking sound. He pressed the worst expectations down in his throat like a dry mouthful of air. Outside the handover area, a temporary table had been set up. The tabletop was clean enough to glare. A metal box and a stack of papers sat beside it. The soldier responsible for handover slid a fingertip along the seal edge to confirm nothing had lifted, then placed the clear bag inside the marked zone. Hans recognized the worn, whitened cover at once and the photograph's small sleeve beside it, now arranged more neatly than memory. The handover man turned the bag under the light so the number and the seal impression showed fully, then wiped the bag's surface with a cloth as if erasing any possible argument. The immediate consequence was that Hans had to stand in place longer. Time was stretched by procedure, and his breathing grew shallower with it. Then the handover man pushed the bag closer by a small distance and signaled for Hans to confirm through the plastic. Hans held his fingertip above it, then pressed down. Cold bled through his skin. The direct consequence was immediate. The handover man pulled the bag back, wiped off the print, and pressed the seal edge tight again. The added pressure left a deeper impression, as if pressing his contact with the object into evidence. A guard pulled Hans' hands back to his sides and signaled that he must wait for the next instruction. Any extra movement would be treated as reason for reinspection. The process left no space for humiliation, only verification. The handover man matched the bag's number against the tag on Hans's wrist, then turned the photograph sleeve's heat-sealed edge under the light to confirm it was intact. Only then did he push a paper toward Hans. One of Hans' hands was unbound. He had to sign his name on the marked line and press a thumbprint beside it. If the print was too faint, he had to do it again. When ink touched his skin, the light code in the night sky rose in his mind, as if the same rhythm were being copied somewhere else. When he bent his head, he saw a line of handwritten Latin letters near the margin. 2 words close together, Gute Wahl. It meant good choice. Inside the pocket poetry book lay a black and white photograph, like an ember softened by sweat, yet refusing to go out. He had thought the end of waiting would be mockery or confiscation, yet he lost his direction of resistance in front of that neat line of writing. The hollow in his chest filled as if with cold water, and he had to press his breathing back into the beat of rules. It was not boasting and not a threat. It read like a closing remark left by an inspector after completing routine work. Another limitation followed at once. He could not fit his own tragic narrative back into place. He could only watch it placed effortlessly by someone else's procedure into a category of harmless and returnable. The handover man pushed the clear bag toward him, requiring one more check of seal and number before he left. Hans took it with both hands, still hot from repeated inking. The plastic edge dug into the bones of his palm, and the immediate consequence was that he had to slow his step so he would not tear the seal himself and trigger more checks and delay. The road back to camp felt shorter than the walk in, or his attention no longer fell on the road. He was allowed to keep the book with him, but it had to be presented for spot checks at fixed times, and the photograph could not be removed from its sleeve. Hans pressed the bag to his chest and felt that the clear plastic was harder to pass through than wire. He no longer tried to use silence as defiance. He treated each roll call and inspection as a boundary to cross, saving his strength for keeping that small weight within the boundary. At the same time, Carter received the final backfill at the front, confirming that the correlated property had been fully rechecked and held no intelligence value. The conclusion of procedure allowed him to fill the last empty field, close the metal box, and lock the recording and receipts into their assigned position on the shelf. Then he returned to the headset and the noise, filing the rhythm away as one entry in the system that had been properly handled. The camp schedule was chopped into equal segments by whistles. After morning roll call, Hans was assigned to hauling and patching. His palms rubbed against coarse hemp rope until thin calluses formed like a new skin. He kept the clear bag hidden along the inside of his jacket, against his ribs where it was least likely to be struck. The constraint was clear and fixed. The bag had to be surrendered for inspection at specified times. The seal could not be broken by him. He could only move it inside the allowed range as if it were part of his body. When the first routine inspection arrived, he placed the bag on the table and let his arms hang naturally, his gaze held beyond the marked line. The inspector in gloves pressed lightly along the seal impression to confirm the tape had not lifted, then swept the photograph sleeve's heat-sealed edge under the lamp. The immediate consequence was that the bag was held briefly for logging. A clerk copied the number onto a card and slid the card into a wooden box. Hans stood in place and learned to let his breathing follow someone else's rhythm instead of letting feeling drive his movement. When the bag was returned, he did not rush to open the book. The plastic glare laid a layer of distance over paper. In the minutes before lights out, he could only recognize the whitened cover and the curve of the spine through the bag. He tried once to tuck the bag into the folds of his shirt and pad the corners with cloth strips. At the next inspection, he was ordered to remove the strips on the spot, and the seal was pressed again. His waiting stretched to the end of ration distribution. The cost taught him to pull every alteration back to the minimum, keeping only the motions that would not trigger recheck. Hunger and exhaustion could stir memory into mud, so he pinned his attention to repeatable details, the seal impressions, the handwriting of the number, whether the photograph sleeve's corner stayed flat. Each confirmation carried an immediate consequence. The next day's labor went with less drifting. He wasted less strength on ineffective resistance. When someone in the barracks tried to trade objects for food, he pressed the bag closer but no longer used posture to proclaim its meaning. He let silence stop the talk, avoiding any extra search from guards. Weeks later, the camp began transferring prisoners to a larger holding point. The line along the road moved slowly, and the sound of engines made men instinctively look for gaps. Hans held the bag against his chest and kept his hands visible on the outside as required, avoiding any misunderstanding that he was hiding something. The transfer inspection happened again. The bag was placed on another table. The seal was pressed tight again. The number was confirmed consistent. The photograph sleeve was held up under a lamp to confirm it had not been breached. What he received was not further interrogation, but a brief gesture ordering him forward. Procedure fixed his path into a line with no branches. The new camp had more supplies and tighter management. Each distribution of water and food required lining up by tag number, and any step out of line brought a shove back into place. When Hans queued for water, he first moved the bag to a dry spot before lifting the cup, avoiding dampness that could soften paper edges. The direct consequence was that sometimes he drank one mouthful less, but he experienced fewer rechecks caused by a loosened seal, and time began to flow in a predictable way. At night, he laid the bag flat beside his bedding, making sure no one's boot soles stepped on it. When inspection came the next day and the seal remained intact, he could return to the line on time without losing his brief rest. Before one labor assignment, a clerk required everyone to reconfirm the status of personal property. Hans was taken to the table and had to present his wrist tag and the bag's number together, then add another fingerprint on paper. Sweat made the ink shine and the print came out slightly blurred. The immediate consequence was that he was ordered to do it again and held longer. The line behind him pushed and crowded. He could only steady his finger and make the impression clear enough to pass. The clerk collected the sheet without expression and shoved him back into a gap in the line, the motion clean and restrained. He once tried to request that the seal be opened, if only so he could read a page in daylight and confirm the lines still existed. A guard's gesture forced the attempt back, pointing to the same rule. If the seal was broken, it would require reinspection and could be held longer. The direct consequence was that he turned reading into a memory drill. In hauling brakes, he silently recited lines he had once known, letting them travel through him without sound, rather than letting his hands touch the plastic. The front listening post had moved north. Carter placed the case folder for the anomaly into a thicker crate and transferred it with other low-priority samples to a rear records room. On the day of transfer, his superiors ordered spot checks on several old cases to confirm chains were complete. Carter pulled out the recording box, receipts and bearings in order and matched dates against equipment status. He filled missing fields from the same day's duty log. The direct consequence was that the crate could be sealed and archived, and he avoided accountability for small omissions. Then he returned to the headset and the noise, continuing to filter for the next signal that might alter the rhythm. The war in North Africa tightened on calendars toward an expected end. Hans did not receive any echo in the name of poetry. What he received was a bag that could be inspected, logged, returned, and the boundaries that arrived with it. At night he kept it beside his pillow and listened to guards' footsteps pacing the sand. He knew the light code had been stored as record and his hands stored as prints. In the days that remained, he pressed the whitened cover lightly, only in the gaps permitted by rules, letting the hardness of paper remind him he was still alive within some kind of order, and